I should just introduce myself. I'm Doug Spearson. I'm the co-chair of our Ride the Rail organization here in Dubuque. First of all, we'd like to welcome everybody to our public Zoom here. During the program, we're going to go into mute all for the presentation because we are going to be recording this to be so it can be allowed for later viewing. You can either submit your questions by chat or wait until later, and we can unmute. So, but at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Mathews. He's president and CEO of the Rail Passenger Association, largest advocacy group for passenger rail in the nation. After 20, you're going to have to correct these if I make a mistake here, Jim. But after a successful 26 years in aviation news publishing, Jim has led the RPA since 2015. Under his leadership, RPA has helped fend off 6 house attacks on Amtrak, as well as a White House attack on Amtrak long distance network in 2016. 2018, RPA introduced 26 million Americans to rail travel through the innovative Summer by Rail internship program. Jim is a lifelong train traveler who sees passenger rail as an economic development tool for communities and as a way to meet the transportation challenges of the 21st century in the most environmentally responsible way. As a volunteer, Mathews has served on an Amtrak Customer Advisory Committee for 6 years, including 2 years leading the ACAC as chairman. In 2016, he was appointed to a two-year term on the National Advisory Committee on Travel and Tourism Infrastructure and was reappointed in 2018. He also participates in the Federal Railroad Administration Regional Plan Study Groups and is a voting member of the FRA's Rail Safety Advisory Committee and the RSAC Hazardous Materials Working Group. He's currently pursuing studies in international relations and government at Harvard University. So please welcome Jim. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And no corrections needed. That was good. Thank you so much, Doug. Well, thank you everybody for carving some time out of your evening to go through this. I was asked to kind of take people through the state of play in DC on where we stand on rail, passenger rail policy, and funding. If you had asked me this any other year, this would probably be a very short presentation. But as we all know, this has been an eventful year for passenger rail and for rail policy. It's been an eventful year in good ways and in bad. What I'm going to do is share my screen, he says, hopefully. There it is. And I'm going to ask if everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Yes.
Super. Okay. So as I said, this is a heck of a year to be doing this briefing. It's a very exciting time. There's a lot of really good stuff happening, but we're not out of the woods yet, and we need advocates to kind of be vigilant and to continue to keep the pressure on, and not just for getting kind of the headline news pieces of legislation through, but to continue to keep people sold on the benefits of passenger rail. Even after these bills are passed, signed into law, if they are, and it's still an if, we're going to find that the programs that are in them are going to be under constant attack. And it's going to be important for all of us as advocates to really make that effort to continue to reinforce the benefits of passenger rail and of what we're trying to do here. So it's a very confusing time, and you can be forgiven for kind of not fully understanding the lay of the land here when it comes to these bills and kind of where we are. We are right now in really a 3-track infrastructure program. And the thing that everyone has sort of focused in on right now is what has become the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Jobs Act. That is what replaces the previous 5-year surface transportation authorization called the FAST Act. And anyone who has been paying attention to rail advocacy the last 2 or 3 years, certainly here at Rail Passengers, we have been beating everybody over the head with the importance of getting the FAST Act reauthorized. It should have been reauthorized last year. Because of the election and pandemic and everything else, it got kicked down the road for another year. So here we are today with this bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which replaces the FAST Act. It is not passed yet. We had hoped it would be passed before September 30th. More on that in a minute. You've all heard in the news the budget reconciliation. There's infrastructure provisions in the reconciliation bill. That's the $3.5 trillion bill. What it really is a $350 billion per year infrastructure and climate and other bill. That is separate from the Jobs Act. And then the third piece of the infrastructure investment will come in the appropriations measure, which is the transportation, the normal transportation appropriations. So there's 3 different chunks, 3 different bills that have to get done here. Come on. Okay, so here's where we are. It's important to kind of keep all of these straight, and I'm going to take everybody through these because it is important to understand kind of what's in each bill and kind of where we are. So the Jobs Act, that has $550 billion in new infrastructure spending over 5 years. That includes $66 billion in guaranteed rail funding, $34 billion in authorized rail funding. Now the Senate passed that in August. It was a bipartisan vote. It was 69 to 30. And then it got passed back over to the House. It should have gone to the House. It didn't. And so we needed a short-term extension. That was passed through the Congress through Halloween. The reason why it didn't get passed was because the Biden administration and the Progressive Caucus of Democrats on the Hill, they want this Jobs Act bill linked with the reconciliation bill. That's was $3.5 trillion, $350 billion a year bill. That has been since pared back primarily because of centrists like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema pushing back on the price tag on the reconciliation measure. So that has now come down to about a $2 trillion bill. That reconciliation package right now, as of today, continues to contain $10 billion, sort of a down payment really on high-speed rail, and $10 billion for mass transit, which is linked to housing. And that's kind of built around this idea of transit-oriented development. So the transportation section of the reconciliation measure passed through the House Transportation and Infrastructure panel. It was a party line vote, September 14th. The Senate does not want to have markups on this bill. And so they're going to go through the Senate Budget Committee. As I said before, the administration and the Progressive Caucus want these 2 bills connected. Centrist Democrats and the Republicans want these bills not connected. And so that's where the logjam has been. And so what we have right now is a kind of a stalemate for this very important funding, which exists in these 2 different buckets. Here's another piece, the transportation budget, the appropriation. That budget, because the fiscal year ended on September 30th, we're now into fiscal 2022. In theory, we don't have a budget. Congress passed a short-term extension through December 3rd. That gives everybody a chance to catch their breath and try to pass an appropriations bill, a 1-year appropriations bill. This is very important. Amtrak and transit operations really depend on this bill. And as September 30th was approaching and it looked as if we weren't going to get a bill, Amtrak was already putting plans in place to furlough people because they weren't going to have anybody to pay. and DOT was furloughing folks. So this has a very, very real and acute effect on the services that we get every day if this doesn't go through. This bill was going to give folks an opportunity to write some additional policy measures into the measure as well. So let's go through the Jobs Act. Everyone wants, this is super confusing. It's confusing for those of us who do this every day. So I'm going to kind of take you through this in a little bit of a slow way, but I think it's important because a lot of advocates kind of, they call us all the time and they want to know, what can I do? What can I do to help? What am I calling to support? And it's hard because the labels keep changing and the packages keep changing, particularly this year as the Biden administration made infrastructure and jobs investment such a key pillar of its first year agenda. So again, think to what was the FAST Act. That was the Surface Transportation Authorization. That's a 5-year policy bill. And that is, as I said, that's an authorization. So what that does is that creates a policy framework for appropriations spending. Okay, so it has funding levels in it, which says that these funding levels are authorized, but then you need an appropriation to actually pay for them. So I needed to do one more thing. This started out as something called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework. That was the deal that was being worked out by the Senate, by Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats. This was worked out quite separately from the House and the House Transportation and Infrastructure investment bill that was put together by Chairman DeFazio. To some extent, Chairman DeFazio was effectively excluded from this, which further created issues with trying to get this thing through both chambers. Because Chairman DeFazio was feeling like he was cut out of the process, because to some extent he was. So this is what is in the Jobs Act. For convenience, just to understand kind of tracking where all the money goes, we separated it into the Surface Transportation Investment Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Deal. But these things together constitute the Jobs Act. And you'll see these pretty substantial increases in investment in Amtrak and the Northeast Corridor, in the national network, and in important grant programs. Chrissy grants get plussed up here to a large extent. There's additional national network funding. There's additional Northeast Corridor funding. There's this federal state partnership for passenger rail. And again, this is $7.2 billion just in fiscal 22 for this federal state partnership for passenger rail. So these are substantial sums of money. And this is why we say this is transformative investment in passenger rail in the United States. Because think about it, Amtrak for years got by on roughly $1.9 to $2 billion a year of appropriation. And here we're looking at way more than that. So this gives us the ability to really move forward on a lot of investments that frankly have been put off for decades. So this is very good news to get this through. The 5-year total here would be $101 billion in rail and passenger rail. So it's an extraordinary amount of money. So Amtrak's national network in the Jobs Act alone would get $16 billion over 5 years, plus $12.7 billion in authorized funds. This helps us to get new rolling stock. If any of you saw my testimony before the House 2 years ago, alongside Richard Anderson, I pointed out that we were all basically riding around in a rolling museum, and I held up my little baggie full of repair parts that passengers travel with to repair the coaches that they travel in. So this is long overdue. It also gives us the ability to do ADA upgrades, really make our system genuinely accessible. There's a ton of deferred capital out there that has to get done. And the $50 million set aside for restoration and enhancement grants, that's an important one too, because that used to be aimed primarily at the Gulf Coast restoration, the Sunset east of New Orleans. But now there's enough money in there that we can start talking about bringing other routes back as well. So that's really terrific news. On the Northeast Corridor, it's $6 billion over 5 years, plus $6.6 billion in authorized funds. Again, new rolling stock to replace the single level cars, upgrading storage and maintenance facilities, again with the ADA upgrades. And there's important capital work that needs to be done there as well. The timeline here is interesting. Once this bill passes, the US DOT has to supply the Congress with a plan to spend the first year's money within 180 days of enactment of the bill. One of the concerns going into this legislative season was that we might have a repeat of where we were a decade ago, where some money came through and nobody was really prepared to do anything with it. And so there was a lot of kind of wasted time. And everyone recognizes now that it is important to get some quick wins. It's important to actually make a meaningful difference in the lives of ordinary people out there trying to take the trains. I had this conversation with the FRA administrator last Wednesday, standing in Chicago Union Station. And we talked at length about how important it is to really get some things out the door quickly and show people that this is actually going to make a difference, and not just be studies and plans and money for consultants. So the Congress wanted the DOT to oversee this rather than just having Amtrak do it, because they want to open that aperture, if you will, so that other folks can be part of the conversation. Every year after this, the DOT is going to have to include the detailed plan for the passenger rail spending as part of their reporting to Congress. The Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail Grant Program, $36 billion guaranteed. About $24 billion or less goes to the Northeast Corridor. And so we're looking at state of good repair, corridor expansion, and upgrades. This grant program is going to focus on positive economic and employment impacts. So what does that mean? It means that it's not going to be just drawing lines on a map. It says, gee, wouldn't it be cool to have a train here? The idea is to show that if you put money into a particular route or set of routes, that we're going to get more jobs, more economic benefits for the communities served. Now, the good news is that just about everywhere you do that, you can demonstrate a very strong return on the taxpayer's dollar. So this shouldn't be a very difficult thing to do. But in the past, these kinds of things were evaluated solely on the basis of fare box recovery and capital cost. How much does it cost me to build it? And then how much am I going to collect in ticket revenues against what I spend? And what's the deficit? And people really focused on that subsidy number. So now the selection criteria really are going to be focused more on what is the overall benefit to the country of having a particular service. And that's how these grants are going to be awarded. Safety, competitiveness, reliability, emissions, resilience in climate change, and all of that. All of those things are going to play a role, as well as inclusion in the corridor development program that has already been identified. Restoration and enhancement grants. Again, this is a bringing back service that was once there. So it'll look at additional frequencies on current service, which is the ultimate low-hanging, low-hanging fruit. This is stuff we could get done fairly quickly. New onboard services, new service, extension of current service, and there's a glide slope here so that we can kind of ease the pain of the states trying to take this on for the shorter routes if that's required. There's a 6-year subsidy starting out at 90%, sliding down to 80, and then 70, and so forth. And that's negotiable. That 30% may actually rise by the time you actually get to year 6 or 7. But that's the glide slope that's laid out right now. but it's $250 million guaranteed and $250 million authorized. The CRISI program, the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Grants, $5 billion. They threw in clean locomotives and Hyperloop. Hyperloop has managed to get themselves inserted in here. Okay. Another one that's important is the railroad crossing elimination grants. As we've seen just in the past few days, we still have a problem with at-grade crossings in this country. And to the extent that we can eliminate or enhance the safety on at-grade crossings, that would be a good thing. So $3 billion guaranteed here, and it states tribal organizations, MPOs, port authorities, a wide range of municipal actors can play in there. So that's in the job. All of that is in the rail grant portion of the Jobs Act. This one's important for passenger rail advocates. The Amtrak Daily Long Distance Service Study. So we've been pushing, as you know, to take the Sunset Limited and the Cardinal and make them into daily trains. We had significant interest, particularly in the Cardinal, from Senator Manchin's office. We worked very closely with Senator Manchin to try to get a provision into these bills that would simply declare that it is time to run daily trains and that daily is the minimum service level for a route. We weren't able to get that to stick, but this was what came out of it, that there will be a study, and it's going to be a short study. It has to be done within 2 years. And you have to look at all the long distance routes that have been dropped, non-daily existing services, the Cardinal and the Sunset, and particularly looking at what some people call flyover country, right? So we want to really see, because we know the benefits of Amtrak trains in rural communities. So the study is going to give extra credit, if you will, to routes that really do advance the economic and social well-being of rural communities. We're going to look at all the options for restoring or enhancing to a daily status. And then there's going to be a priority list that comes out of that study. And part of the study is to figure out the federal and non-federal funding sources that would go along with that. Now, some of that could actually be elsewhere in the bill. So it's not starting at zero. The DOT is going to lead this study, and we have been written into the study as a stakeholder. You see that highlighted in yellow there. Sean Jeans Gale and I worked very closely with committee staff on these provisions, and we were successful in making sure that passenger voices are actually included formally as stakeholders in the study, and we will participate in the study with the DOT as an equal partner. Corridor identification, we talked about that earlier. The DOT is going to establish a program to identify projects to add and improve intercity passenger rail corridors. Now, we've already seen the Amtrak Connects Us map. That is Amtrak's corridor identification and development program. DOT has to establish a program to identify projects within 180 days and create a project pipeline within a year. So that's fairly quick in bureaucratic terms. And preference is going to be given to part of a regional or interregional passenger rail study. So the Midwest Rail Plan is going to figure highly in here. The Southwest Plan, the Southeast Plan, obviously environmental, congestion, all these kinds of public benefits we've talked about before. In general, you'll see this as a theme running throughout these bills, that we're moving beyond what does it cost to run the service and how much are we going to get back in ticket revenue. And we're really looking at, in a quantifiable way, the benefits of the passenger rail service to the communities served, and that is going to figure into the priority list. So that alone is good news, and rural communities are basically going to get a few extra stars in that list, again, because of the benefits to the rural communities. I suspect it's going to look a lot like Amtrak Connects Us, just because a lot of that work has already been done. But the DOT does want to look at this independently. When I've spoken to them about it, they have their own ideas, and everyone wants to work closely together to get the best and quickest priority list out the door. So what's a corridor? It's a new intercity route of less than 750 miles. And so we'll be looking at either enhancements, restoring service over that kind of a route, or increasing the frequency of a long distance route over that corridor. All of these kinds of things will be included in the development program, and those in turn will get preferential treatment in the subsequent studies. This one's very important too. And, you know, about 2 years ago, when we started pushing very hard on food and beverage, dining car, and things like that, we got a few snickers from folks who were like, well, look, we're talking about investing in next generation equipment and opening new lines. Is food really that important? Well, of course it's important, particularly if you're on the train for a long period of time. And, you know, even an 8-hour train trip, you're going to have to eat. So it is important. And one of the roadblocks that had been in place, and one of the reasons we got to the flexible and contemporary dining service, was this requirement called the MICA Amendment, dates back many, many years, that food and beverage services could only be provided if the revenues break even. You could not spend any appropriated dollars to deliver food and beverage service, which was a huge straitjacket. And so this bill, we were able to get bipartisan support for removing that requirement. The bill directs Amtrak to establish a working group to develop recommendations to improve the onboard food and beverage services. There's a provision in there that's written to include nonprofit organizations representing Amtrak passengers. That would be us. That was written particularly so that we could participate in this working group. As many of you may know, I have a staffer on my team who is an Escoffier trained chef. And Madison has been working very hard on making sure that we have the right kinds of recommendations to make within the working group that are grounded in the realities of catering and large-scale food service. So this isn't going to be pie in the sky, gee, wouldn't it be nice? We have some actual professional expertise to contribute here. And we do think that what we're seeing on the Western trains is really an example of what can be done and should be done system-wide. So very, very encouraged that this got done. And it's debatable whether Amtrak would have done what it did on the Western trains, restoring the traditional dining service, without this provision kind of looming out there. But the fact is the provision is now in place. Amtrak already has a good head start on meeting it. The working group will have a lot of positive feedback to work from. And I think this is going to result in a lot of really good stuff for the traveling public here in the next year or 2 or 3. A few other things. We successfully got a provision in the Jobs Act to revise the composition of the board of directors of Amtrak so that it is more representative of the riding public and more responsive to the riding public. Surface Transportation Board. This is essentially the policy regulator for rail in this country. It's what replaced the Interstate Commerce Commission, and they have generally had a skeletal passenger rail organization within the STB, and this bill directs the STB to hire additional full-time employees so that it really beefs up that passenger rail expertise within the agency. And the chairman of the STB, Marty Olbermann, is very committed to this. He and I have talked about this extensively over the past few months, even before this came along in the bill. And that with the new metrics and standards that were put into place last year, after 10 years of fighting all the way up to the Supreme Court to get them in place, there's going to be, we think, a lot of case volume going to the Surface Transportation Board that involves passenger rail. So beefing up that passenger rail desk is going to be a really worthwhile thing. There's a competitive grant program to set up interstate rail compacts, up to 10 rail compacts. And so this is really modeled on the Southern Rail Commission and kind of cloning the Southern Rail Commission around the rest of the country. And we've been telling folks for a couple of years now to expect something like this. And a handful of folks have organized commissions or something like it to kind of get in line for this. But a lot of folks have not. And they're going to wish they had. Because this compact provision does provide the funding for the organizations like the Southern Rail Commission to spring up around the rest of the country. So that's the Jobs Act. Now I want to turn to budget reconciliation. The part that we care about for our purposes, high-speed rail assistance grants. It's $10 billion guaranteed over 5 years. There's a 90% federal share and 10% local. You have to chip in. High speed in this instance means it's got to be 160 miles an hour or better on shared use, 186 miles an hour on dedicated right-of-way. Not less than 10% of the money should be dedicated to corridor planning. And that's environmental assessments, feasibility studies, so on and so forth. It is not for use on the main line Northeast Corridor. So the idea is to get high-speed rail out from the Northeast Corridor and into other places. So there's capital projects that that can be done here. Public agencies, interstate compact, all of those folks are eligible to apply here, and Amtrak is eligible to apply. $10 billion sounds like a lot of money. I certainly don't have $10 billion lying around in my bank account. But when you look at what's really required for high-speed rail, this is not going to buy us very much. And so I say this not because I don't want it, but because I want to set expectations for what's possible with $10 billion over 5 years with a 10% local match required. I describe this as a down payment on high-speed rail, but this is not enough to get us really where we need to go on high-speed rail. This is an example of the kind of thing that we're going to need advocates to continue to push for even after these bills pass. So I know that that was kind of a rush through a very complicated set of slides, but I did think it was important to take everybody through the 3 different buckets and to understand that that is really what we're trying to, as advocates, push for any and all of these bills. And even after they pass, those individual provisions could fall out again, or could be withdrawn, or could have another piece of legislation to repeal them. So we really do need everybody's help in kind of, I hate to put it this way, but keeping it sold. And that's going to be a very important role for advocates to play. Once these bills do pass, call your congressional offices and thank them. Call them and say, thank you for your support. Thank you for helping us get this through. Help them out to understand that this is something that you want. If your folks didn't vote for it, call them and say, I'm glad this passed. I'm sorry you didn't vote for it, but I live here, I vote here, and I care about it, and I would have appreciated your vote. You got to just keep reminding them over and over and over again. It's a constant engagement. And so that's really the take-home message that I want to leave with all of you, is that even when we get this stuff through, you still got to email, you still got to call, you still got to write, you still got to do your congressional visits. You got to keep that pressure on and make sure that your local officials also keep the pressure on, your mayors and local elected officials, because when the congressional folks hear from the local electeds, it really does mean a lot. So that was the Mach 12 version of what's happening in Washington. I'm happy to take questions.